the 7th chapter, verses 11 through 17. Soon afterward, Jesus went with his disciples to the village of Nain, and a large crowd followed him. A funeral procession was coming out as he approached the village gate. The young man who had died was a widow's only son, and a large crowd from the village was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart overflowed with compassion. "Don't cry," he said. Then he walked over to the coffin and touched it, and the bearers stopped. "Young man," he said, "I tell you, get up." Then the dead boy sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. Great fear swept the crowd, and they praised God, saying, "A mighty prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people today." And the news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding countryside. Let the people of God say, amen. Now, I want to apologize in advance because this might be a short sermon. In that, for some reason, Thursday, my voice started leaving me, and the rest of me feels good. But the voice goes and comes as it chooses. So hopefully God's message will get through no matter what. When I was thinking about and praying about and contemplating what message God would want me to share with you through this passage, Luke 7 verses 11 through 17 kind of jumped out in this fashion for me. The phrase offering comfort in tragedies of life. Offering comfort in tragedies of life came to mind, and it reminds me that three words also come up. Those three words are obviously compassion and powerlessness and vulnerable. Compassion, powerless, and vulnerable. I love a good story. I don't know about you, but I love the stories. I don't really like to do my God work or my theological discussion from just a purely position statement. I love it when Jesus has brought it home to us in a fashion that is kind of more in everyday life. So whomever was the author, definitely inspired by God, who brought this scene into our holy scriptures, made it a part of our holy writ, knew that it was important for us to be able to connect with God's people and to connect with the life of Jesus in a way that was real for us, and that not only triggered our intellectual curiosity, but touched our compassionate hearts. God's people are called to acknowledge, I believe, as we unpack this theme today, we are called to acknowledge the pain, disappointment, and loss of hope people in their daily lives experience, so that we may share a transforming love born through Christian faith in Jesus. This kind of faith should offer hope in emotional and physical and spiritual ways. Luke 7 again is one more story designed to help us focus on the journey between life and death. You get that? The journey between life and death. That time period between that dash on your gravestone or your tombstone that says born this date, died this date. What happens in the dash, others have said, is important. We are invited to extend comfort in the most emotional and tragic times in people's lives, stated the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary. One theologian, William Lloyd Allen, challenges the church, that's us, as the people of God, to witness by word and deed in the most difficult circumstances. I have found myself struggling with the context of this passage, how it reminds us that interruptions can be holy and divinely driven sometimes. I must admit that I suffer with ADD, just in case you hadn't figured it out by now, Luann. I have to struggle to stay on task. And therefore, I try to schedule my life and program my life and program the programs that I'm in charge of, whether it's here at Willow Hill or other places. And so when I thought about how Jesus was, you might say, interrupted on his way into the village to do his ministry by this funeral procession. Now, they weren't in cars, they were actually walking, and they were carrying the bodies. And I can imagine this big crowd around this grieving woman, this person who we're told was a widow who had lost her husband earlier, and now she lost her son. That in itself is an emotional, firestorm, if you would. But Jesus didn't go around her. He didn't ignore it and keep on about his business. He took this opportunity. The Bible tells us he had compassion for the woman, but he also engaged in some serious ministry work. Some would say, yeah, he healed the boy. He rose. He helped him to rise from, quote, the dead. But that's not the whole story. As some would say, we remember a commentator named Paul Harvey, and he would say the rest of the story is Jesus got into the core of what this woman needed. Jesus modeled for us that God cares not only about our emotional and spiritual state, but God cares about where we are in our lives, how we live in our lives, how we are able to sustain ourselves and sustain our economic and sustain our physical states. Life tragedies can offer opportunities to extend compassion like this funeral did for Jesus. As we look at human interruptions as divine opportunities to witness to and share God's hope, we could be among representatives of this great compassion that should flow out of a living relationship with Jesus and others. I sometimes tell you how I've had encounters with persons from institutions that either have a name relationship with Methodist Church or annual conferences, or what they would say is a historical relationship. They have sometimes used the phrase historical to describe how they relate to the Methodist Church. I was once in ministry near one of those institutions, and they would say to me, yes, our university has a historical relationship with the Methodist Church. And I would say, good, I was a history major in college. What does historical mean? And they would turn red because they had no clue. Or to them, they would say, well, that means the church really doesn't have much to do with what we are today, because we are an institution of higher learning, and it founded us. And people, those little old ladies from the church, they still leave money to the institution, and we want to keep that coming. And but we really don't want you in our business. Actually, you really aren't invited into our business. So a living relationship for them is not what we are struggling with today. To them, that historical relationship is really dead. We want a living relationship with Jesus. We don't want a historical relationship. We don't want a relationship that's based on our parents being the ones who chose our faith. We want a relationship with God that impacts each and every day of our lives, that speaks hope in times of despair, that lets joy come out when it seems like there's only darkness and hopelessness around. This living relationship that acknowledges that there are times in which we just struggle. Times like this widow had, and times like Jairus when his daughter died had. And Jesus got into the middle of their pain. And he just didn't say, you know how people used to post on Facebook, sending prayers and thoughts. Jesus did more than send prayers and thoughts, and so should we. Prayers and thoughts with action. I love it, the tradition of Christianity that I've chosen to be a part of and that I hope you embrace as well is a tradition that gets into the thick of people's lives, especially where they hurt, especially where they don't seem to see anything good occurring. And we make things happen. I love how the people called Methodists found hospitals and schools and medical facilities and job training facilities and have institutions that speak to where society hurts the most. We don't just send prayers and thoughts. We don't just think about it or write about it. We engage. And that is part of us living into the fullness of the capacity and the fullness of what it means to offer comfort in times of tragedy. When we feel powerless, Jesus says, rise. Now, the text and translation in which I read from you says the son got up. But in a different translation, it says Jesus looked at the boy and he said, rise, get up. It's not just about the physical resurrection, but Jesus knew that in that word rise, there would be hope, not just because the woman loved her son, which I'm sure she probably did dearly, but because in her current context, where she had no male figure, no husband or no son to provide for her daily needs, her physical needs, her food, her housing, her clothing, her actual physical protection, she was vulnerable to the world's worst thing. She was powerless in that culture. And so Jesus spoke hope into her life and says to us to do the same. Who in our lives, who do we encounter in our communities, in our society, feel powerless? Who in our communities and societies feel as though they are vulnerable to the worst aspects of our world? Those are the people that God calls us to. Those are the places that God sends us to. Those are the places that the Spirit says, speak hope with that after-school reading tutorial program. Speak life with that training program for young moms to be able to know how to raise their children healthily and safely. Speak hope to young men who don't have a clue about how to be a father because they've never seen one. The fatherless, and teach them how to take care of not only their children, but how to work and maintain a job so that they can be whom God has called them to be. To me, that word rise says all of that and then some. Biblical scholar David Bartlett has pointed out how those who first heard Luke's gospel, they already knew the rest of the story about Jesus. Bartlett goes on to inspire his readers by reminding us that the goal of the story is grounded again in this word rise. The grieving woman was told the good news using that exact word, rise, which restored hope to Jairus and to her. We are called to stand with the vulnerable again in our society. Biblical scholars from the prophetic tradition say that the church is called to confront the forces tearing apart the families and social fabric of our society and of our support systems, to confront those things that are seeking to enlarge the levels of the poor, and to not speak hope and encouragement. We today are called to learn to do good, seek justice, correct and address oppression, bring justice, I like that word, to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause, according to Isaiah 1 verse 7. Some of the victims of modern day family breakdowns and death are many of the children and youth served by our church as we join together with other United Methodists across this conference. From Route 80 south to the tip of Illinois, we join together with them in our conference, Our Kids Initiative. I want to thank you for your support of that in the past. We're right on track. We're going to do some more, though, and I'm looking forward to what we're going to do to lift up this initiative, Our Conference, Our Kids, that speaks hope into those 5 agencies from a spiritual perspective, from Chaddock School to the Northwest, to Cunningham Children's Home to the east, to Baby Fold to a little bit further east, to East St. Louis, down to Leslie Bates Davis Neighborhood House, and then over on Route 64, on I-64 to Mount Vernon, to the Sparrow Children's Home, which used to be the Methodist Children's Home of Mount Vernon. All of those agencies speak hope to children and youth who have found themselves vulnerable. Jesus calls us to offer compassion and hope to. For the church to be the authentic. Notice I said authentic because it's possible we could be fake. I've been to churches, unfortunately, where they were fake. But I love that Willow Hill is not one of them, where we embrace this authenticity. So for us to be the authentic people of God, divine compassion must be our prime motivation. Divine compassion. As it was for Jesus with the widow in Nain, according to William Lloyd Allen. I'd invite our worship leaders back up at this time. As I conclude this message on offering comfort in the tragedies of life, I wonder if anyone here has wondered did Brad get that wrong? Because you know sometimes I do. Did he mean offering comfort through the tragedies of life? No, I meant in the tragedies of life. As Jesus was there with the widow and mother as a beloved child of God, so too God calls us, that's you and that's me and that's others, into the middle of others' struggles, into the middle of their messy lives. Sometimes we can offer hope and healing, and other times we will just be with them. That ministry of presence in addition to a ministry of hope. I thank you for just being with people who need to know they're not alone and that God loves them because you live into the living faith that Jesus was a model and a front runner of. Thank you again.